wildlife habitats.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. Shaka, how are you?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans suggest, an awful son of Africa.
Well, I look forward to our interactive discussion.
I look forward to that too.
Yes. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. I was away under the weather, but I'm back in full swing and ready to take on Shaka. So Shaka, let's maybe start in Africa. A lot of people are mourning the late president of Kenya, Daniel Arap Moi, who passed away at the age of 95 years old. He was 95 years young. A lot of people credit him for some of the development we see in Kenya. A lot of people criticize him for some of the things that went wrong in Kenya. So he has had sort of a mixed legacy. Bring us up to speed. You had an opportunity to interact with him on a number of occasions. He was your buddy. Bring us up to speed.
I have to say that, Paul, I was one of those few privileged, really, and honored and humbled to have had the opportunity to interact with the late Kenyan president, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Mind you, it took me about 7 years to access him. I was always told by some of his handlers that I was going to meet him and interview him and stuff like that, but it didn't happen until 1999, when I was coming from Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, having interviewed the then President Laurent Desire Kabila in Lubumbashi, that I learned that Tanzania's founding president, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, had died. And I went through Nairobi and asked the VOA if they could allow me to go and pay my final respects to the Mwalimu in Dar es Salaam. And that's where I was lucky to be introduced to then Kenyan President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi by the then Tanzanian Foreign Minister Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete,
who later became president.
Who later, of course, became president in his own right. And the man was very happy to meet me, and he suggested that I should meet him in Nairobi. And I did, and the rest is history. So really, to me, this is an end of an era. This is a man who was obviously not immortal. He was mortal, and therefore was likely to have done some bad things and some good and great things. And I think that you can really put him on balance. You know, a man that I respected so much when I was still very, very young in Kabale, southwestern Uganda, going through primary school and junior high school, was a man who was Kenya's first vice president, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who happened to be, by the way, the father of a former Kenyan Prime Minister, Raila Odinga. This man wrote a book called Not Yet Uhuru, because he split with his former colleague, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first, of course, president. They split ideologically and what have you, and so he wrote a book called Not Yet Uhuru. It's not yet independence. This man had the opportunity to wait for his turn and actually later become president of Kenya if Jomo Kenyatta died. But he didn't. He tried to play the role of a co-president, and eventually he was fired. But this man looked at Moi and actually said that Moi looked like a giraffe. You know, a giraffe is a very tall animal. that because of that, he saw very far.
Interesting.
And he was able to see very far, and in fact, he did see very far. When I first met him, and I was interviewing him to react and reflect on the death of his former colleague, President, Nyerere, I remember him talking about how Nyerere was a great man. And he said, I admired him more, even though he used to call me Daniel, that he used to call him Daniel, meaning they were basically on first name basis. And he would call him Mwalimu. He said, the reason I admired Nyerere very, very much is because in 1961, he offered to delay the independence of the then Tanganyika territory so that both Kenya and Uganda would actually be independent, so that the three countries could actually form what he called the East African Federation. Unfortunately, things didn't work out that way.
A lot of people who have been maybe talking about the passing of the late president have sort of, in a way, said that Moi, going back to what you said earlier, that he was a remarkable guy in the sense that he had that vision, that ability to look at things and be able to analyze things. For example, he would say, he would challenge people who would say that he had overstayed in power. He would give examples of, say, look at your neighbors, look at Somalia, look at Uganda, look at Sudan. In a way, trying to tell Kenyans that he's the best alternative.
He would present himself as, of course, a symbol of stability. Of course, if I were to ask him the question, I would have asked him whether in fact, stability and peace are the absence of war, absence of violence, and not perhaps the presence of social, economic, political justice for all.
But there are those who could argue that despite all that, his ruthlessness, he was able to at least for example, deal with the opposition in Kenya in a very civilized way compared to his neighbors across the border.
To be honest with you, if some Kenyans listen to you talking like that, you probably wouldn't be allowed to walk on Koinange Street next time you are downtown Nairobi, because he also did not treat the opposition particularly well. There's no question about it. But
at least he had respect for human beings. He had respect for them.
I don't think it makes sense for you really to compare what was happening in Kenya and the neighboring countries in that context, because I am reminded of an English diplomat who once told me about South Africa. I was an undergraduate student in New York, and he said, you know, this thing called apartheid, it may look like it is a bad thing because you live in New York and you come from Uganda. Uganda is supposed to be an independent country, but the black people in South Africa are better off than a lot of black people in independent Africa. And I asked him, I said, Ian, let's be very honest. Do you honestly think that a South African black person will wake up each morning, look in the mirror, and say, yes, I am suffering because of apartheid and what have you, but at least I'm better off than my brothers in Zimbabwe who are in an independent country, or Uganda for that matter. So there are certain things sometimes that you refrain really from comparing. But let's face it, for all the bad things the man may have done, one thing that is very clear, he was an education president.
He built a lot of schools.
He built a lot of schools. And in fact, I had the opportunity to drive around the country in 2004. And I went to some of these Nyayo schools and stuff like that. He also provided, for example, milk to students and what have you and stuff like that. And people really, you know, they basically give him that credit.
Even a person like me across on the Ugandan side, I used to drink a milk courtesy of Kenyan government.
Really?
That's correct.
You know, it is very interesting that in 2001, I happened to have the honor of securing a license from him for Voice of America to introduce an FM radio broadcaster in Nairobi, which was in fact the first for VOA.
Oh, wow, that's remarkable.
Yes, I managed to do that because I was asked by the then director of Voice of America, Sunday Anga. He had been told that I knew the president, that the president had a soft spot for me. Could I possibly try to do a favor for VOA? I said, and why not? If I can do it, I would definitely ask him. And he obliged. But he said, I can only do that, Shaka, because you are an African and you are a good African. You've been doing very wonderful work here in America. He actually said, let us give you the license. And he told the director, make sure that when you start that radio and you are ready to open it, you come to Nairobi with my brother here, Shaka Sali, so that we can celebrate it. And you know, we went to Nairobi, and I happened to be the MC. We were at the Nairobi Serena Hotel. And Moi surprised me by saying that I have lived in America for a very long time, but that I have never, never forgotten my roots of Africa. And he said, I am a president of Kenya. I have the benefit, for example, of intelligence institutions and stuff like that. I have a press unit and what have you. But you know, sometimes my friend Shaka Sali, he actually is the person who tells me what is happening in my neighborhood and beyond. And yet, he lives in America. This is a man who was, by the way, regarded as the professor of politics, even though he does not have a single degree, single credential in it, but he did it the Moi way, in a practical way. He did it, and he survived as president for 24 years. And he was able also to navigate and negotiate a smooth, peaceful transfer of power. He handed over power to a man called Emilio Mwai Kibaki, who was representing a united opposition, who obviously earlier had been a vice president under Moi for 10 years. So this is a man who managed his exit as a gentleman and an officer. He is a man, for no matter what you think of him, who was able to go even beyond the smooth transition of handing over power from himself to another, but he was able to live in his country and actually die in his country peacefully. He, in a sense, was a symbol sincerely of continuity and relative peace and stability that Kenyans enjoyed.
Yeah, Shaka, there's somebody called Charles Sasel here who is challenging. He says, despite the fact that President Moi referred to you as that you would learn politics about Africa from you, he's challenging you and he's saying Shaka is totally out of touch with African politics. His political observations are more theoretical. He needs to be on the ground to be able to give a legit view of African politics.
I think Charles, to some degree, probably may have a point, even though I don't agree with really most of what he says, because let's face it, I was born in Kabale, southwestern Uganda, a place called Chikunjiri, and I have been a beneficiary and a victim of African politics. I know what politics is and is not when it comes to Africa, because I still have relatives, I have colleagues and friends who I may not actually be interacting with physically on a daily basis. But guess what? I may live in America physically, and I do, and I have done so for the last 43 years. But to be honest with you, and you know a little bit about me and that, in fact, you are probably here because I did not meet you in New York. I met you at an institution called Makerere University, Kampala.
That's correct.
1997, correct?
Yes.
And here we are. So the thing is, I don't think that you need necessarily to stay in your neighborhood in order to know what is happening in your neighborhood and beyond. In fact, there is a saying in our language, in our culture, that the individual who does not go away to go and explore and visit and what have you, thinks that his mother, is the best cook. Because he has never had the benefit really of tasting other people's cuisines. Now, in my particular case, I interact with Africans almost on a daily basis, both here in Washington and those who are still on the continent. Sometimes I have to provide what I call foreign aid. People who ask me to help them subsidize their students' fees, tuition, and stuff like that. People who ask me to help them with health care bills and stuff like that. I talk to my people. And what have we? In fact, today, I was talking to a friend in Uganda earlier today. And I told her that, I may live here in the United States, and I have lived here for a very, very long time. But almost every other aspect of me, I find it really rooted, very deeply rooted in Africa. I don't think there is any single day that passes when I don't talk about an African or something that is happening in some parts of Africa. Even right here at the Voice of America in the Africa division, we are very well represented from West Africa, North Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, and what have you. So really, my tribe, in fact, is African. My nation, to me, is Africa with neither borders or boundaries. But that does not mean that I know everything. Of course, I do not. In fact, be careful about anybody who claims or alleges to know everything about Africa because they live in Africa. Because, in fact, they are telling you lies.
How would you respond to another criticism here from Paul Songa? Shaka, this piece of feeding West yet pretending to be close to Africans is not right.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
First of all, I do not pretend to be African because, in fact, I am African. To quote perhaps someone that is regarded as the greatest son that Africa probably has yet produced, the Osajefo of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he actually once said that he was not an African because he was born in Africa. He was an African because Africa was born in him. I think I sympathize with the kid from Nkrofur. And I have visited Nkrofur, by the way, where he was born. I went there courtesy of his only daughter, Samia. We drove from Accra so many years ago. So this business about saying I'm pretending to be an African, I don't know where that person really lives. I don't know where he comes from. I am as good an African as anybody. In fact, one thing that he may not know is that by staying at home in your neighborhood and what have you, does not guarantee that you even know very well your neighborhood. In fact, you might even know it better if you go somewhere else and
I don't know my
reflect.
neighbors right here.
In fact, for me, before I left Uganda, I had the opportunity because of having been in the military. When we were officer cadets, we traveled the entire Republic of Uganda. So I even know beyond Kabale. I have been to Gulu. I have been to Ajumani. I have been to Moyo. I have been to Acholi. I have been, you name it. And then Africa. I have not only read about Africa, I have degrees to boot in Africa. But I have also had the privilege and the great opportunities of crisscrossing the continent to such an extent that I could actually claim to really know Africa better than Charles.
Yeah, that's a good segue, Shaka. Let's move on. Let's talk about former Sudanese President Bashir, who the ruling government right now has sort of come to a conclusion that he has to be sent to The Hague to answer for his crimes. He's accused of killing nearly 300,000 people in the Darfur region. in 2003.
Probably not for killing, but perhaps being responsible for the death of those people, because he happened to be not only to be president of the Sudan, but he was also commander-in-chief of the Sudanese armed forces and the Janjaweed when they were operating in Darfur.
But how would you respond to those people who have said that there is no direct evidence linking him to the killings in Darfur, despite the fact that he was the person in charge? They had a lot of rebel movements fighting in Darfur.
Well, we'll have to wait and see whether the ICC in The Hague can actually come up with evidence. You know that they actually lost the case, for example, against the former Ivorian president, Laurent Gbagbo. In fact, precisely because of what you said, they did not find what you would call incontrovertible evidence supporting the prosecutor's case. So for that one, I think we have to wait and see. But I think it is a positive, really, step in the right direction, because it means that it sends a signal to some of those executives who are at the political helm of their countries that if, in fact, you commit a crime or you commit crimes against humanity, you are not above the law. You have no immunity. You have to account for it.
Let's go to a quick comment here. This is something that has devastated the entire East African region. Let's go to Hasafa Vianney. Thanks, Shaka. I want to ask you about how can East African countries fight locusts? Locusts are devastating people's crops. They have literally taken down some places. People are going to be starving very soon as a result of these locusts.
It is very true. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a former college mate of mine, Fred Mpangana in Kawale yesterday, and he was reminding me that locusts, in fact, hit Uganda in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. I think this is the time when the government really has to stand up and do what it's supposed to do. This is the time that it can actually use the resources available to it so that it can, in fact, protect and support its own people. This is the time it should mobilize the army, mobilize the police.
The army to do what?
The Air Force, for example. They can use the Air Force.
Locusts?
They can use the Air Force, for example.
To shoot at locusts?
No, to fly planes and use some kind of insecticides and stuff like that and spray.
Right.
Yeah, I think it can work. In fact, they are doing it in Ethiopia. It seems to be really bearing some results. But they should be able to figure out some kind of plan, some effective plan that supports people. And because really, you are talking about a people who are now at the mercy of these animals which come from deserts and stuff like that. And by the way, they actually apparently fly 100 miles each day. 100 miles each day. And, you know, they are going to cause, of course, what you would call food insecurity. Because they can come and eat all your maize, eat all your sorghum. They can come and eat all your beans. You know, you name it, whatever it is there, even grass, actually, for that matter.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go to another quicker comment. Mutandre Mitembe. How important is it to reduce presidential powers in order to make government institutions more independent, especially in light of what we are seeing in Sudan? Had Bashir relinquished power, handed power
just like Daniel Toroti Arap Moi.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about a different story.
Yeah, this is where really I appeal to those African presidents, rulers, who really have served beyond the call of duty, to begin sincerely negotiating and figuring out how to navigate their way out of power, so that they can also at least learn from Moi, at least in the sense that Moi was able, like I said, he was able to peacefully and smoothly hand over power from himself to someone else. And therefore, he was able, in fact, to guarantee at least what you would call peace and stability for Kenya. And I think that it can be done. I think that we should see that happening in Uganda. We should be able to see that happening in Rwanda. We should see a man called Paul Biya doing the needful in Cameroon. We should see, for example, look at Burundi. You're talking about Pierre Nkurunziza. He has decided, for example, at least that this year he's not going to run for office. He has, in fact, anointed General Evariste. So he's going to pass on the baton. I think that these individuals should sit down and reflect and think sincerely and put the interests of their people and their country above their personal, petty, parochial political interests. And the international community should also step in. It should step in the sense that it no longer does business with an army officer who shoots his way to State House and announces a coup. It no longer does that. I think that it is high time the international community adopted that position to not doing business as usual with the types of individuals who shift their constitutional political goalposts for personal and political reasons. But I am not talking about not changing or amending any constitution, because I may not have gone to law school, but I know that a constitution is a living document. I am not saying, by the way, that is carved out of stone, and therefore it cannot go under any amendment. No, it can go under an amendment, but not an amendment that is there for the benefit of an individual. We should no longer talk about this business of having, for example, individuals who are uniquely gifted. No.
How about people who argue that it's a club? There is no way this club can call its members out. They belong to a certain club, you know?
You know, I think that we should move beyond that. We should do whatever we think is in the best interest of community, society, not individuals. Not individuals sincerely who are patriotic to their stomachs, the stomachs of their families or friends. It should be about people. It should be about everybody having equal shares in this corporation called a Republic of Uganda, a Republic of Kenya, a Republic of Cameroon, and you name it. It should be about people who are in positions of coming up with policies that reflect themselves in terms of putting smiles on people's faces, rather than sincerely coming up with policies that reflect misery. I don't think you feel good, really, when your people are experiencing misery. Your people are not well fed. Your children do not have opportunities to go to school and become useful members of their communities and society at large. I think these are people who go to church every Sunday. Some of them are Muslims, they go to the mosques every Friday. They should do these things in a manner that even God would be on their side.
Well, I wish we had more time to go further into those discussions. Thank you so much for watching Shaka Extra Time. It's a show that comes to you every Tuesday. We look forward to hosting you on another edition. Until then, thank you so long from Washington. Yeah, thank you so much.